real conversations, and some hard truths. Gangs, drugs, and guns. Giving a voice to those willing to sacrifice. We have stories that need to be told. We have lessons that need to be taught. Protect and serve. Welcome to The Quiet Professional. Hey everybody, welcome back. Nathan Romas with you. Today we are going to be talking about offender reintegration, their management, and the public notification of an offender's release. I have both Sergeant Greg Coutura and Dr. Sandy Jung here. A little background on both. Sergeant Coutura is a 23-year member of the Edmonton Police Service. In 2012, he led the operationalizing of the Youth Offender Management Team, known as Y50. This was a program to address youth violence through the management of the top 50 violent youth offenders in Edmonton. In 2016, Sergeant Coutura went to the Behavioral Assessment Unit, where he changed them to a broader approach in balancing the needs of offenders and the protection of the public. And we also have Dr. Jung here, who hasn't been on the show since December of 2022. So we're going to have to get you on more. Dr. Jung is a psychology professor at MacEwan University in Edmonton and a registered forensic psychologist. She's an active researcher, and as part of her psychology crime lab, she focuses on the risk and management of individuals who've perpetrated sexual assault, child sexual exploitation, and intimate partner violence. Her research is funded by both internal and major federal grants, and she frequently collaborates with law enforcement, which is why we have you both on here today. So welcome to both of you.
Great. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Nathan.
I figured maybe we could kind of just start by defining some of the things that we're actually talking about, because we're talking about a very specific part of an offender's, their life in the system and where they are in reintegration or rehabilitation. So I want to make sure some of these terms are correct. Can you tell us, whichever one wants to start, where exactly do you two kind of come into this process for an offender, and maybe some definitions of what that is?
Sure. I mean, I can start and then Greg can probably add on to that. When we think about individuals who are released into the community, oftentimes people think about those who are under parole or in probation. And that often gets confused with what me and Greg have been working on for the last number of years, is that those individuals who are under probation and parole receive a number of services, and they're usually under things like the National Parole Board, or they're under the provincial ministry who provide services to those who are on probation. But the ones that we're talking about here are individuals who are being released into the community after they fully served their sentence. And these are individuals that don't have the kind of supports that parolees or probationers have. So just to give you that little bit of the backdrop to explain that component of it, but I think Greg can probably elaborate more on what happens with this group.
Yeah, thanks, Sandy. Just further to what she said, the specific group of offenders that we're talking about are those offenders who have committed significant personal injury offenses, which land them as their index offense. So that's their main offense that lands them into custody or into whether it be a provincial or federal institution. So they're sentenced to whatever time for that personal injury offense that they've committed. Then Corrections Canada completes risk assessments on all these individuals. And for the ones that we're talking about today, they come out as a high-risk individual. So basically, Corrections feels that if they're released into the public, whether it be on parole or another way, that their risk to the public is still higher than the risk that they're willing to take. So they hold these offenders right up to the expiry date.
Okay.
So it's correct to actually kind of starts the process, or kickstarts this process of designating an offender as high risk through their assessments with their psychologist. Very quickly, what happens then is once an offender is designated as a high-risk offender, there's a national protocol for high-risk offenders that's been created that all provinces follow to some degree. And essentially what happens is once an offender is nearing the end of their sentence, so they've been sentenced, let's say, for 10 years for a sexual assault, that offender, upon, as we get closer to the end of their warrant expiry date, which is their end of sentence date, that offender can choose where they want to live. For the period of time that I was in BAU, we were having more offenders released to the Edmonton area than any other municipality in Alberta. So, like, for instance, we had about 32 offenders that we were managing at one time, with EPS. Calgary had 5 warrant expiry offenders. So it just kind of gives you just some numbers to play with there. But when an offender says they want to come to Edmonton, Corrections Canada puts together, it's called a warrant expiry package or a WED package, and then they send it to EPS. It comes down, it's sent to the chief, but then obviously he's not going to be the one doing anything with it. It then filters down to BAU as the designated unit for high-risk offenders. And then that's kind of kickstarts our process for how we go about dealing with them. But that's how offenders are initially designated as high risk. It's through corrections. They do an assessment, and then it kind of comes to us through this warrant expiry package.
Okay. So, and just for further clarification, are these offenders, are they so they're not in the statutory release period, like, the federal sentencing, they do 2/3 and then they can get out, like they apply, I guess, to get out, and they can be in the community while still under their sentencing. Provincial is 3/4, I believe they serve.
Yeah, these offenders can apply for release just like any other parolee can apply, or stat release. They can still apply for those, but they're denied because of the assessment completed by corrections at the time designated them as a high risk offender. So their release in the community is such that they will commit another offense upon release, and corrections that want to hold that. I guess through their assessments, they feel that the offender is such a high risk. Now, when we're talking about what percentage of the population, it's probably really small of the offender population. It's really small. It's about 5 to 10%, maybe, of the offender population is designated high risk offenders. The vast majority go off on parole or are released at 1/3 or 2/3 of their sentence, or whatever those mandated dates are. But for these guys, they come before the parole board, they come before all these other release bodies, and they're denied at that point because of the high risk assessment completed.
Yeah, and keep in mind too, when you're talking about the 1/3 and 2/3 that everyone has a right to when they're serving federal time. So once they go through Corrections Canada, they're going through the federal sentence, and they're serving their time in some kind of custody institution. So everyone can apply for that when you are in that institution. But if they haven't gone through treatment, they haven't abided by the rules and regulations while they're in prison, they have new charges that emerge, say, for example, while they're serving time, say, at one of the federal institutions, like, say, Bowden, what you're going to end up seeing is that they're probably not going to be eligible or deemed eligible by the parole board who makes that decision. So there's usually 2 people that make that decision after they go through a full assessment. But at that point in time, if they're not deemed eligible at 1/3 for any kind of parole, and then not deemed eligible at 2/3, which is that mandatory time, and most people usually are released at 2/3 after they serve 2/3 of their sentence. And the reason why it's a good thing they're actually being released, a lot of people don't like that idea of an individual being released on parole, is because then they get reintegrated into the community. And so they have that 1/3 of their sentence while they're under the parole board being supervised by parole officers. And they have a full gamut of services available to them until they fully reach their warrant expiry date.
Okay.
And so the problem is that the cases that Greg's talking about, where Edmonton seems to get quite a number of these cases, is that when they're released, they have no contact with parole because they're not on parole, right? That's out of their jurisdiction. So if they are being released, and keep in mind, offenders are being released every day. So I think when we see a notification, people assume, oh my God, why are they releasing them? Well, actually, this is the one you know about.
Yeah,
There are many
exactly.
people being released every day, whether it's under parole or they've reached their warrant expiry date. So
Okay.
these individuals just happen to be the very high risk cases that Greg's talking about, which is, a very small fraction of those cases get released. But because they're so high risk, there's certain parameters that are in place that require monitoring and police involvement at that point.
Does this only include people that are in the federal sentencing side, so over 2 years, or is there any people that could be in like the provincial level of sentencing, so the 2 years less a day, however they word that fancy thing?
Greg, want to speak to that?
I can answer that. They come through the federal system because it's the federal system who really are the ones that are doing those risk assessments.
Hmm.
Plus, it's also the offenses. Their index offense that brought them into custody is a pretty significant personal injury offense. Like we're talking aggravated assaults, aggravated sexual assaults on minors.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a pretty significant offense that they will receive a sentence of more than 2 years for. So they're for us, they mainly for BAU, they came out of like any federal institution. We got some from Edmonton, but they came across all of Canada. Like we got offenders from Kent Institution in BC, all the way up from Nova Scotia, where we would receive individuals from them as well. So they're designated, or their risk assessment is completed within the federal system, and then, but they could also be serving provincial time once they're released. And if they breach their conditions, then they're under the admittedly sentenced under that 2 years less a day kind of thing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's more rare under the provincial system just because more often than not, you see people who are assigned 2 years less a day, say 18 months in custody. But they usually what happens is that the judges usually add on a probation period. And so because they have that supervision in the community, it's rare that you're ever going to see them, being released on something called an 810, just purely because they already have that support.
Yeah. The 810 peace bonds?
810 peace bond,
okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm wondering, like, when so what we're trying to do is like reintegrate them, kind of like a smoother transition, instead of just you're done in jail or prison, like see you later, and just throw them into the community. Is there any thought to, well, why don't we just have a system where they serve their time that they've been given? So if you're given 10 years, you serve 10 years, and then after that, put them on peace bond, or have another system where it's like, okay, now you have to report, or this is where we do the reintegration. So what I'm kind of asking is, why is the reintegration done while you're in still under a sentence, instead of just you serve your time, then you start the reintegration process? So do you know what the thinking was in there?
So, I mean, really, when we think about how the federal system works, and I'm certainly not saying it's a perfect system, but the reason why we have parole is to provide them an opportunity for them to actually reintegrate into the community, right? To try to build some pro-social skills, some employment skills, get them linked to their community while they're on parole, where they have, like I said, this kind of surround support system around them that helps them with whether it's their mental health or it's with employment, all those kinds of things. And so it's typically part of that system that's already there, assuming that they are being able to be released on parole for good behavior, right?
Yeah.
Assuming that. And I think a majority of individuals who go through the federal system are actually eligible at some point for parole. It's, again, this really rare number of individuals who serve time in the prison system where they're just not going to be eligible, because one is they're either extremely antisocial, right? So they have definitely don't care about sort of the consequences that hit them, and they're not really willing or interested in engaging in any kind of change. So whether it means some kind of rehabilitation, alcohol and drug programs, whatever it might be that's offered in the institution.
Mm-hmm.
So if because of that's the case, then there's a system that allows them to be able to get better and to gain some pro-social skills. But if they've refused all that, or they've done poorly at it, or they've manipulated while they've been in treatment and manipulated other offenders, then obviously they're never going to be eligible for being released during, for parole.
Okay.
So those are the rare ones that really end up coming out, who are still deemed high risk. They haven't changed anything. They haven't gone through treatment. They haven't addressed any of the risk factors. And now they're coming out. And, first thing that happens is, we talked about this peace bond, for example. And part of that is potentially a community notification that comes out as well. So when people hear about the community notification, oftentimes people get outraged, about what happens. And they go, well, why are they releasing them? Or even worse, they say, why are police releasing them? As if police actually had any control on that. So that's another thing too, is there's a misunderstanding about what these community notifications are actually about, because people think we're talking about parole, and we're not talking about parole at all.
Yeah.
Mention the 810 peace bond. That's the safety net that is built into the criminal code for these specific high-risk offenders who are released at their warrant expiry date. So once they reach their end of sentence and they're released, they are not under anyone's supervision.
Yeah.
They're free to go anywhere. So it is kind of, I guess, a bit weird that corrections holds these guys right up to the warrant expiry date, knowing how much of a risk they are, and then because they're held right to the very last day, they're kind of walked out of the institution, and then they're free. So that's where the 810, it's actually an 810.1 and an 810.2 peace bond within the criminal code. The 810.1 is for sexual offenses under the age of anyone who's committed an index offense under the age of 16. And the 810.2 is the commission of a serious personal injury offense.
Okay.
So adult sexual offenders, adult violent offenders, they would fall under the police would then, so it's then incumbent upon the police to apply for an 810.1 peace bond or an 810.2 peace bond, which asks the court to consider conditions be added to these individuals. And what we strive to do is, we get this assessment from corrections, this warrant expiry package, about 2 to 3 months prior to the end of their sentence. So it gives the police the opportunity to prepare their own court reports and conduct their own kind of rational assessments on whether we should seek this peace bond. And if we do, then it gives time to get them into court prior to their release or on the day of their release. Many times we'll have them come to Edmonton, like if they're in BC and Kent institution, we'll have them transferred from Kent to the Edmonton to the Max a few days before their warrant expiry date, and then bring them into court on their actual warrant expiry date day. But then we get them into court on this 810.1 or 810.2 peace bond. So they are released then on conditions.
Okay. So maybe we'll kind of move into the notification side of things. Can you explain kind of the background on this process, if you know, like maybe the history of it? Why is it done? And then we'll kind of get into the effects on both sides, like the public side and what they think of these things, and then also the offender side. So what is the background on the notification system? Why does it exist? How is it actually kind of carried out? So why do we only see, the 1 out of 10 or whatever it might be that we get notified for? So what's the history there?
That's a good question. I'm not familiar with 10, 20 years ago how this notification, because it's been happening for years and years and years, right? So I'm not exactly sure how, for the rational thinking at the time, but I can tell you currently, or when I was in BAU, and then currently how they work now, is under Section 32 of the FOIP Act. I have it pulled up. It's under Division 4, Public Health and Safety. Information must be disclosed if in the public interest, whether or not a request for access is made. The head of a public body must, without delay, disclose to the public, I'm kind of reading from it now, to an affected to any person or to an applicant, information about a risk of significant harm to the environment or to the health or safety of the public, of the affected group of people or person or the applicant. So essentially what that means is the police and through LAS, who have viewed this and have, I guess, certified it or agreed with that.
Given their blessing.
Yes.
That's what we look for.
Yeah, all the time, right? That's the section of the act that we use as the police for doing a public notification of a high risk offender being released into the community.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I'd say that too. It's funny because if you look at, and I hate comparing, but if you look at other countries, if you look at the country south of us, for example, the public notifications that come out of there look completely different than what we do in Canada, right? So this is very specific to what Greg was talking about with 810.1, 810.2. That's in the criminal code for those individuals who are deemed high risk. And that doesn't just isolate it to just those individuals who've committed sexual offenses. In the US, there's only notifications that come out of their sex offender registry that are public notifications for sex offenders only. So if you have someone who's violent, who's stabbed people, who's been engaged in, attempted homicides, and they've sexual offending is not in their gamut of offending behavior, that wouldn't be someone that we would hear a notification about.
Okay.
Unless there's a warrant for their arrest or something like that, which is fairly typical across all countries, really. So if we're talking about those individuals in the States, it's really only isolated sexual offenders. In Canada, it's really different because we have 810.1, which is individuals who've committed offenses against children, basically. And then 810.2 is much more broader, like what Greg was saying. It's not just sexual offenses against adult women, or adult men, but also any kind of violent offenses, right? So a history of attempted, homicide or aggravated assaults in their history, and repeated ones, then that also falls under 810.2. So in Canada, it's really not about only sexual offenders. It's about all kinds of individuals who can commit any kind of violence and who are likely to commit violence again. So it's a little different. But to be honest with you, if you asked about the question about, why do we have this and historically why we have this, I think there's always a public outcry when we hear about someone being released in the community or some critical incident occurring, right? Whether it's an assault by someone who's been recently released, you're always going to get that kind of public outcry. And I think the automatic assumption is that if we know about these cases being released, that somehow or another we're going to prevent them from actually committing any further offenses.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll be honest with you, there's absolutely no science behind that.
Yeah.
But it's somehow comforting for the public to think that if I know about it, that it's going to make things better.
Well, we need to get the point of Minority Report, where you can see crimes about to happen.
Absolutely.
I really like the kind of the contrast that you have though between the US and Canada, because even when I talk to American guests on here, they always seem to play it at the extremes. So for them, when it seems like a lot of their law enforcement, when you right off the bat up front dealing with anybody on the street, the individual has a lot more freedoms, but they also have a lot more protections. But if they do catch you doing something or they sentence you, you're gone for hundreds of years. Whereas in Canada, we kind of play it 60-40. It's we're kind of down the middle of the road. You give up a little more of your liberties. Maybe you have less rights. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but you just, the police have a little more that they can do up front than that you can in the States. But on the back end, I think is where we complain and go, wow, that person only got 7 years for a murder. It's what is going on here? So yeah, I really like those contrasts. Obviously different systems built on different histories. But no, it's really good way to put it. So one of the things I wanted to talk about was kind of the effect of these notifications on the public. So what do you see from the public? Is there a way to get feedback from this? Or is it just I don't know, somebody sends angry hate mail to somebody and then you hear about it? And part of the reason I ask is because the article that I read and we're kind of talking about today, you had a line in there that said, our research has shown that it doesn't matter how we present information, the public is less inclined to see any merit in reintegration or rehabilitation. So I wonder if you could kind of expand on that and then just talk a bit about what exactly the notification process, like what the effects have been on the public.
We can talk about the science behind it, and I'll let Greg tell you a bit about sort of we look at ground
Um,
level, what's actually happening with those
yeah.
notifications. Um, so in terms of the research that we've done in our lab, and this has been done actually, especially with notifications even in the US, right? So there's a lot of Americans have done a lot of research on those notifications. But what we found is that we've tried to change, in one of the recent studies that we just published, was that we tried to change the notification to try to include additional information, try to make sure it's not legalese, like basically too complicated language, make it as simple as possible versus someone who's, a notification that gives you all this elaborate kind of, following, this person has to follow a recognizance using big
Hmm.
language that most public don't understand. And regardless of how we changed that, it didn't seem to matter that people felt that, this person was at a high risk no matter what, that this person wasn't going to be rehabilitated. The only time that they changed that was if it was a sex offender or if it was a non-sex offender. They really felt strongly about the sex offender. So it didn't matter.
So is it they're picking up like just they see a key word in there and then they just don't even read the rest of it. Like
Yeah.
they see the headline and they're like, that's all I need to know. I don't need to read the rest.
Right. These,
Okay.
if they see high risk offender, women need to be aware that this person is on the streets, has committed multiple sexual offenses. That's it. They hear sexual offenses, and that's that's the end
Yeah.
of it. Doesn't matter what you're saying at that point in time, right? Even when we question them about sort of the information that came out of it, like, did you pick up on the idea that this person has served out their time? So basically, we're taking away their rights of notifying you and also monitoring them beyond the sentence that they were assigned, right? Doesn't matter, right? The bottom line is people saw that and they saw a sexual offender and they said, no, this person is high risk no matter what. And I don't care what kind of rehab you're going to give this person, they're not going to change. So it really didn't make that much of a difference. We were really hoping that we could improve notifications because right now the current research I'm looking at is looking at notifications across Canada. And they vary from province to province, city to city completely. And how they are being monitored is also varied as well.
Oh yeah.
Me and Greg have had many conversations about how what we do in Edmonton looks very different than when you look at, say, Peel and their police service, completely different.
Maybe just before we jump to you, Greg, to talk about all the mail you might receive or something, but kind of on the academic side, what is the recidivism rate? What do we see for these people who actually get out, and maybe just kind of limited to the ones that you put the notifications out about? Do we see a high percentage of them reoffending?
Well, I can't say for all that because there's very little research, to be honest with you. The papers
Okay.
that Greg and I published are probably, I'd say right now I have two published right now. I'd probably say 2 out of 3 publications that have ever been published on 810 offenders.
Oh, really?
So
Okay.
there's really not a lot out there. Yeah, it's kind of scary when you think about that because this has been going on for decades, right? It's been in the criminal code for a number of years, but there's just not a lot known about it.
Well, and just considering how, I guess, polarizing it might be for people or how upset people might get about someone getting released and it says like this person's a high likelihood to reoffend. You think someone in all these years might have been like, maybe we should see, is this true? Is there truth to what people are worried about? So, yeah.
I mean, yeah, I can add to if you're wondering about sort of recidivism rates in general,
Mhm.
there is a lot of research on that. So if you look at sexual offenders in general, on average, and I'm not talking about only high risk offenders, but I'm talking about on average across all individuals serving, say, federal time, you're talking about somewhere between about 13 to 17% of them will go on to reoffend again sexually. Right. Now,
Okay.
keep in mind, I'm going to qualify that number because those are the ones who get caught. So those are
Yeah.
the reported cases, right? I can't speak to those who have never been reported. So if we look at the number of them that basically get recharged again, yeah, we're talking about 13 to 17% of sex offenders. But if you look at violent offenders, you're talking about 40 to 60%, depending on the
Okay.
sample. If you look at only high risk offenders, you're never going to have a percentage that is more than 50%. And my students always get surprises because I always start my classes with that. What percentage do you think sex offenders go on to reoffend again? I was like 80%.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, it's not 80%. It's way lower than that.
I was going to say, I don't even, when you said 13 to 17, I don't even know what to make of that, because those are such unusual numbers. Yeah, I would expect like 80 or 20 or something, but 13 to 17, those aren't nice round numbers. Greg, did you want to at least just talk about any of the public perception or messaging that you do get? Are you getting kind of the hate mail from people, or, how do you get notified about public response?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when we talk about public notifications, there's two kind of main avenues. One, you have to look at it from the public's perspective, and then also from the offender's perspective, which I think we can kind of get into a bit later on from the offender side. Public side, our corporate communication monitors, obviously, the responses to their publications of these notifications, and through their own monitoring of it in the social media feeds, and that they know that there is a huge response, and they always tell us that there is a huge uptick in information not necessarily sent to the police, but commented on their responses through various social media feeds.
Oh, okay.
So do we get lots of notifications, like personally saying, EPS, why are you releasing this guy? That doesn't really happen. But there's the outcry just in the comments from people about the person being released. There's a huge uptick, and we know that that's going to happen. I guess there's one example I can think of, and rightly or wrongly, whether people agree or disagree, these notifications are useful. I personally believe that they are useful. They're useful in the fact that if you have an offender being released to Edmonton and they have committed their index offenses within the Edmonton area, we may not know all the victims that this individual may have had over the years.
Okay.
Through a notification, we're alerting people of his potential release back into the Edmonton area. And there may be victims that never reported or never came forward that are now alerted to the fact that this person is back in Edmonton. Now, what that may do for the victim, obviously, is traumatic, and there's may bring up past feelings and all those kind of trauma experiences back again. But it also alerts them that this person is back in Edmonton, and they can contact the police who are now supervising this individual. So we have received information from previous victims that, hey, this guy's back. What can I do? So then we're offering advice to them around how they can protect themselves, or if there is a risk for them continually. It may have happened like 10 years ago, but is there a risk now to them with them being released? But it gives us more information so that we now can add that to our supervision of the individual in terms of what we look for.
Yeah.
There's also another case, and I know that there's, say, back and forth examples, but we had a very high-risk domestic offender who was released back to Edmonton. And in his conditions, he had to, any intimate relationship that he got involved in, he had to notify his BAU supervisor prior to entering that relationship. And then we would get an opportunity to meet with that individual, tell them all about who this person is.
Oh, really? Okay.
To them, if they wanted to continue the relationship. However, we had full carte blanche opportunity to tell them about this person, about who they are, about our involvement and everything. So the reason I say that is when this individual was released to Edmonton, he immediately created a Plenty of Fish account under a different identity. But because his picture was posted in the media, we had responses within 2 weeks from 5 different females telling us, hey, he's on Plenty of Fish, and he's searching out romantic relationships that would have been unknown to us because he created these under a different identity.
That's pretty good on them for actually paying attention and doing something about it too.
Absolutely. So then obviously we made some quick decisions and then formed a plan to how we deal with that. So those are some of the, I guess those are some of the advantages to these public notifications. Some of the disadvantages, it creates like public, like the public become worried and scared as a general, but it's really a small portion of the public that is really affected by the release of this person. The general public, Joe citizen just walking around, is probably not going to be impacted by this offender being released, but it creates an
Yeah.
there. So I think it's more so for victim notifications of that, why these notifications are done, and which have been beneficial for us in the past.
Okay. If we can switch to the offender side then and talk about what is the impact on them. I know lots of people are probably going to say, yeah, just lock them up, throw away the key, or who cares? But it's an important part of the conversation and one that we do need to have. So what are we seeing? What are the issues it creates for someone who maybe they have actually reformed or changed their behavior and are trying to get back into a community? And maybe on that, if I can ask as well, are we seeing, are most of these people, do they go back to their home community, or do they often, are we seeing like more success when we move them somewhere else? Like, what does that kind of look like?
Maybe Sandy, you can ask that latter question.
Yeah.
I'm
Sure. What I can say is that, so when individuals get released, when an offender gets released from prison, they need to identify the community they want to go back to, and usually it's because they go back to a place where they have some supports, right? So they've got family, or they know they can go back to a job there, that kind of thing. So normally that's what I'd say most offenders would choose. The problem, though, of course, is that oftentimes those same communities are also places that they have other acquaintances that get them into trouble, right? They get them into shit, excuse the
Yeah.
language, but
Yeah.
so they're going to get into trouble, and they're going to probably get back into the whole sort of engaging in criminal activities again. May get frustrated with trying to live a pro-social life when they're exposed to friends who are not living that life, right? And getting them back into, whether it's drug use or whether it's finding different means of making money that is obviously illegal. So if you end up having that, there's a bit of a balance there, right? You want someone with supports. You want someone being released somewhere where they have supports, but they also want to make sure they're good supports and they're not predominantly ones that are going to be criminal, right? So that's a problem.
Well, and I'm wondering too, like, is it hard if they go back to, say, all their offenses are in Edmonton or the surrounding area, and then they want to go back to Edmonton? It's like, well, you're kind of back in the familiar territory of where you committed crimes, or maybe you run into the people. Like, this is also kind of falls into the conversations I've had about, when we let people out based on race or other things that, well, they tend to go back to their community. So then the police are back in that community, and we just jack up all the stats. Like, now we're constantly in there. It's like, well, they go back to what they know and they kind of reoffend in that area. From what I've seen, I don't know if the stats say that, but so is it also more dangerous if they go back to where they did all their crime?
Yeah. So one thing I will say is that, keep in mind, we don't have control over where they choose to go, and we don't have any say in that whatsoever. So as much as people kind of say, well, why do we let them back into that same city again? It's like, well, we don't have any choice, right? They've served their sentence, and they need to actually be released in the community at this point in time. And we don't have a choice in telling them where to go, right? It's like, oh no, I'm gonna put you in Winnipeg. It's like, no, we can't assign you to a city, right? So when they do get released and they go out there, and you wonder how they're going to perform, I think as long as there's a number of supports that address their risk factors that they're coming in with, that's the most important thing. To bore people to tears about our research. So the research that me and Greg did was not just profiling these cases, but also looking at what is actually, the kinds of things that help people perform better when they're in the community. And what we found with the sample that we looked at, based off of behavioral assessment units cases, is we found that, and I don't even think Greg knows the findings for this yet, actually, but we just did our third paper, and we're still working on that one. So we know for sure risk factors that we already identify for all offenders And they often call them the central 8. Things like, use of abuse of substances, family and marital conflict, things like, being around other criminal acquaintances. We know those are clear-cut risk factors. And we find that if those ones are present, we know they predict how well they're going to do in the community. So reoffending, violating conditions, getting another offense again. But if we don't address those things, and we only address things that they're in high need of, which Greg can probably speak to this mostly, is that if they need housing, they need finances, all those kinds of things. If we only address the social work side of things and we don't address any of the risk factors, well, they're going to stay a high risk. So it's pointless. So regardless of which community they go into, as long as they have the supports to address those risk factors, then you're going to see a reduction in risk. So as much as I'd like to say that, yeah, I'd love to see us move them to an area that's going to be fully supportive, but not necessarily the place where they committed their crimes. But the problem with that, even then, you don't think that someone who's gravitated towards that will still gravitate towards that in some way if they don't address any of the risk factors.
Mm-hmm.
So the risk factors to me are the most important things. That has to be managed first. And if they're managed, then we're going to see reductions in the kind of criminal behavior they engage in.
So that's some of the deficiencies then in the process right now, like as it stands.
I'd say so. That's one thing that me and Greg had. The reason why me and Greg worked together is because he came to me one day and go, "What do I do about these guys?" And this is a really big deal when you think about the kind of roles that police have, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not just investigating. It's not just trying to apprehend someone, which everyone has this kind of prototype of what police do. But another role that they're doing, is involved with, looking at mental health, is looking at, how do we manage the risk of these individuals that we are identified as offenders, right? Police aren't necessarily trained on these areas, when you think about the initial training. This is something that kind of comes into your lap because this is where the expanded roles of policing are, right? And I think that's where the issue sort of came to bay when me and Greg had these conversations is what can we do? Well, there's a whole body of research out there with probation and parole and how we manage risk, but it didn't get carried over to policing because that was never a role that police ever had to carry before, right?
Yeah.
And so trying to learn those things, I think, as part of the kind of foundational training that police need to know, needs to happen. I think police need to know what are those risk factors we should be looking for.
Okay. And that kind of answers one of the things I was wondering about, was just who's responsible for what. Like police seem to have this ever expanding role. So not even just in the behavior management of people, but just everywhere in general. So it's like, is there anybody that isn't involved in the process that should be, or is there I guess what I'm kind of looking for is what solutions are out there, which would lead me into kind of almost the wrap up of what we talk about. But what are the solutions, and what kind of work are you doing that you're trying to make these changes? Like how do we make this change?
I'll let Greg talk first, and then I'll.
Well, Nathan, you and many of us who have even visited HQ over the years or have worked around it, how many times have we seen offenders being released right at the front door,
Yeah.
With their plastic bag, and those are coming from either ERC or from the institution or whatever, and they've reached their sentence date or whatever it is, and then they're just driven there because they don't have other supports in the community, so they're just dropped off in front of HQ and hey, fend for yourself. And so I think that as we approach situations with assisting offenders, when we make the effort to assist the offender, we are also adding to protection of the public at the same time. So it goes hand in hand. If we just ignore offenders who are released with no supports and no services, and we're not looking, as Sandy has said, we're not then viewing them, and the police aren't viewing them from a criminogenic point of view, looking at those kind of risk factors or those needs. If we're not doing that, and we're not adding any supports to them, you can draw a line to public safety, and we're not protecting the public because those offenders being released, no supports, no oversight, or not a really evidence-based oversight. So their likelihood of committing offenses increases. Obviously, you don't have to be a neurosurgeon to understand that link, which directly affects public safety. So if we put the effort in the front, kind of front load it, and really where it needs to start, and I think there's some efforts being made currently, but it's slow, minute efforts, is while in custody, while they're still serving their sentences, there should be plans being made for what kind of supports you're going to have. Where are you going to go from all those, like what Sandy talked about, the social work kind of responses? Do you have ID? It's incredible. Many of them don't even have ID, especially the high risk individuals that are released. Many of them don't even have simple ID. They don't have healthcare. They don't have a housing or even a shelter place to go to. So you can imagine just being released and not having any of that. Well, there's government bureaucracies that you have to go through to get all that kind of stuff, even to get funding from Alberta Works. So,
yeah.
So I think that if those actions can be started while in custody and be built upon, and then there's kind of it's like a continuum. Then they're handed off to an outside agency to continue to build upon the work that was already done within the institution. Now, that has changed over the years. There's certainly been more alignment with that. Police and social work, obviously, you can, over the last number of years, the Community Safety and Wellbeing Bureau being stood up, that has certainly helped build some of those processes. IOM being stood up, that has certainly helped build some of those processes for those more prolific offenders. BAU started to change in that direction prior to all of this happening, prior to the Community Safety and Wellbeing Bureau. We started to make the shift to partnering with social agencies to assist with that. And then the policing role becomes really focused on those criminogenic needs from a kind of an enforcement kind of point of view. How are we protecting the public if we got to be looking in the right field, right?
You know, one thing it makes me think of, just as you're kind of describing like each individual step, I feel like if you maybe even this would be a good study, or like you could do this in the class asking the students, but it's like if you take each individual step and say, okay, this person did this offense, what should we do with them? And they go, lock them up, throw away the key. Okay, we're now releasing this person and we drop them at the corner with their property. What should we do with them? People say like, I don't give a shit. Like, do whatever you want, but why am I responsible for that? And then you go, okay, but none of those provided a solution to the bigger problem of how you want crime to go down. So now if you look at the whole process in the totality, the whole chain, the whole sequence of it, and you go, oh, that's how it's all connected. That's why I need to actually care about what's happening with these people at some point. It's not saying I got to like give them a space in my house, but I got to provide some solutions because you want crime to go down. I get you don't care about that individual little each step of the way, but when you look at it in the context of the bigger picture, you can see how it's all connected. So I think that's why it's again, I could go on a rant about just like headlines and clickbait stuff, but this is why we need to do the education piece and show people, hey, this is how we're trying to stop crime. You have to take care of each of these things along the way. So yeah, I like how you kind of put that there. I said I'd only keep you about an hour, so I just unless you want to add anything there, Sandy, I'm gonna kind of wrap it up here. But how can people find you and your work? I know you were just at a conference, the N5 conference, but where are you guys putting out your work and your papers?
Sure. Do you mind if I just quickly add something to what we're saying? The reaction is interesting from the public about this, and I get that. everyone gets very frustrated. The one thing I'd probably say though is I would never want to renege on sentencing decisions. I think we can do better though with sentencing, and I think that's where these issues can be addressed better. So appropriate risk assessments done at sentencing, and then making sure that judges are using that sentencing to inform their decisions so that this is an appropriate sentence, as opposed to not just looking at just past kind of cases, but let's look at the risk this person poses. And is that going to change? I think we need to lobby more for social services. So we need to lobby more for these individuals, because you can lock them up if you want. But I think what people don't realize, it costs about $100,000 to keep someone in a maximum secure prison every year. Do we want to pay that as taxpayers?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we can lock them up if we want, but expect to pay more taxes, right? And this is exactly what we see in the US, is that they spend so much money on prison systems. And, we're trying to spend more on rehabilitation because it is a lot cheaper, to be honest with you, if we can address those risk factors. So I think it's unreasonable to expect that offenders are going to reintegrate successfully without the skills needed for them to succeed in the community. And I think it takes a community to be able to do that. So like you're saying, it's only our problem. We only see it as our problem when it's in our backyard. But it's, when it's, I'm sorry, but it is in your backyard, right? And
Yeah.
just because it doesn't directly affect you. So I think 810s can be made useful in a lot of ways. So I wouldn't want to change that part of it. So I think those things are to me really key that needs to happen to put in place. And for the life of me, I can't remember what you just asked me.
No, just kind of as we come up to the end of the time, just give you the chance to say, if you have any social media or websites, where can people find you and your work? You were talking about the papers earlier. Are those even available publicly?
Yeah.
So
they can reach out looking at, I have a website and I call it Psychology Crime Lab at MacEwan. So if they actually Google search me, Sandy Jung, and then they Google search, psychology, it'll come up with my website. And usually what I do is I post all the listing of new papers that I recently published. If they want to get access to that paper, and if they have a paywall, for example, to get access to it, they can email me and I can forward it to them.
Okay. And Sarge, do you have anything? Or should people you're in White Ave Beats now, so you just see everybody anyways?
That's right. Whether it be through an email or on the app. I just want to add one more thing to that, Nathan, and it's just around the idea of offender management as EPS kind of expands in this area, and we've seen some growth in it for sure. Offender management to properly manage a violent offender, and those are the ones that I think we should be targeting. Like, to properly manage a violent offender, it's a skill. Like there's some skill involved in managing it properly, according to the science that Sandy has talked about. But in terms of the member, in terms of it, it's not just knocking on a door to make sure that someone's home for their curfew. That's a simplest, most basic form of offender management that we do as a service. But there is so much more that can be gained from simply knocking on the door. And I really think that we need to take a moment to understand and to learn, and people need some training in actually how to manage an offender, how to talk to them. What are you looking for? Have a game plan when you go knock on their door, or when you've been assigned someone to manage, as you know, in your line of work as well.
Yeah.
You don't go knock on a door. You have a game plan that you put together. And what are we looking for? I think that's the one thing that we do it more as a checkbox to say that we've done it. But I think we need to be aware of what are we actually looking for when we do interact with these offenders on a daily basis, whether that be in their home, in a traffic stop, at their work. Because you are constantly watching what they do. And and that's what makes this so intriguing for me. I'm constantly learning on how to deal with people differently. Mm-hmm. It's about becoming an expert in human behavior, really.
Yeah.
To do offender management, because you are constantly, they're assessing you and you're assessing them, right? You're both kind of squaring each other up at the same time. And it's this kind of this movement and this dance that takes place between the two of you But if you get it right, you can advance them along the continuum, kind of away from a criminality point of view. And you're also really increasing the safety to the public at the same time that you're doing this. So it's truly, there is like, I'm fascinated with the area, as you can tell by my history in it, over like 12 years in that area from Y50 to BAU. And now we have an offender strategy on White Avenue for our B teams that we work. So it truly is an art. And I think that but for members to do it properly, I think there needs to be some training in terms of, for those that are interested in how to do it correctly, because there's always one way to do it, but it's the simple way, but there's a much bigger way to do this correctly that will be more satisfying for the members because they're learning and they're actually getting something out of it. So
yeah, you know what? There's something I could even talk to you about offline. Just an idea that might be useful for you. So, but yeah, no, we're just at the end of time. I want to say thanks for coming on here today. I think this is a much needed discussion. So, thank you for taking the time to be on here.
Thank you, Nathan, for having us.
Thank you.